It is my duty to inform the House that the Speaker is unavoidably absent. Therefore, in accordance with the statutes, I would ask the Deputy Speaker to please take the chair.
O eternal Almighty God, from whom all power and wisdom come, we are assembled here before thee to frame such laws as may tend to the welfare and prosperity of our province. Grant, O merciful God, we pray thee, that we may desire only in which is in accordance with thy will, that we seek it with wisdom and know it with certainty and accomplish it perfectly, for the glory and honor of thy name and for the welfare of all our people. Amen. Please be seated. Good morning. The Honourable Opposition House Leader.
Which, Deputy Speaker, could you please canvass the House for leave to allow an exemption to our dress code requirements so that the member for Kiiwetinoong could wear a traditional ribbon shirt as he participates in House proceedings virtually today?
Is there leave to allow an exception to our dress code requirements so that the member from Kiiwetinoong could wear a traditional ribbon shirt as he participates in the House proceedings virtually? Today? Is there leave? Agreed? Leave has been granted. I am now advising the House that I have received a letter from the Government House Leader indicating that the Government Caucus has identified Bill number 237, the Elections Amendment Act, as the first of their 3 selective bills for this session. As a reminder of the House, the Rule 24 permits each recognized party to select up to 3 private member bills per session to proceed to a second reading vote and requires the House Leader to provide written notice as to the date and time of the vote. The Government House Leader has therefore advised that the questions will be put on the second reading motion of Bill 237 this morning, June 1st, 2021 at 10:55 a.m. Should a recorded vote be requested as per Rule 23(7), that vote will be deferred until 11:55 a.m. the next Thursday when the House is sitting to consider private members' business. The Honourable Government House Leader on private members' business.
Number of the bill? Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Could you please call for debate this afternoon, Bill 230, this morning? Boy, it's got to be afternoon somewhere. 237.
It has been called by the Honourable Government House Leader that will be on private members' business will be on Bill 237, the Elections Amendment Act, under the name of the Honourable Member for Brandon East. The Honourable Member for Brandon East.
I move, seconded by the Honourable Member for McPhillips, that Bill 237, the Elections Amendment Act, be now read a second time and be referred to a committee of this House.
It has been moved by the Honourable Member for Brandon East, seconded by the Honourable Member for McPhillips, that Bill number 237, the Elections Amendment Act, be now read for a second time and be referred to the committee of this House. The Honourable Member for Brandon East.
Well, thank you again, and good morning, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's good to see everyone this morning. I am pleased to introduce Bill 237, the Elections Amendment Act, this morning and put a few words on the record. This bill will update the Elections Act by requiring any leader of any recognized party to be open, transparent, and upfront with their past financial records. To do so, this bill would require the leader of any registered political party to file their income tax statements with both their income and their tax payments with the Chief Elections Officer and then to the public. The leaders of recognized parties would disclose the amount of income tax that they have paid for the last 20 years, thereby increasing the transparency for Manitobans in regards to who is running for public office. To reiterate, Mr. Deputy Speaker, leaders of recognized parties would have to disclose their tax information for the last 20 years or until they were 18 years old. You see, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I've been involved in a number of elections as both a volunteer and as a candidate. During these times, I have heard numerous conversations around tax documents of leadership candidates and how these should be made public. In addition, when election season comes around, we often hear the leaders of political parties sparring over releasing their tax forms or requesting their opponents to do so. This legislation would proactively solve this issue by requiring that information on the amount of taxes paid would be released. This establishes a standard that all party leaders will have to abide by. And by putting in legislation, everybody who is seeking the leadership of a party will know well ahead of time what that standard is. The current wording of this bill allows Manitobans to have a deep look into the leader's history of tax payments or evasion. Additionally, it would also be required that they provide their notices of assessment to the Chief Electoral Officer in order that they may verify the accuracy of the declaration. I do want to note that this bill does not require that the actual tax returns or notices of assessments be made public, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Bill 237 simply represents a balance between the transparency that is often asked for around election time while respecting the privacy of personal financial information. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I do believe that while others want to speak, and I do look forward to listening to their comments, that we can all come together and pass this bill. You see, in 2016 general provincial election, the leader of the NDP at that time, Mr. Greg Selinger, made his tax return public, and he called on the other leaders to do the same. Mr. Selinger even went as far as saying that if reelected, he would require all MLAs to make their tax returns public. I'm not going that far with this bill, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Manitobans deserve to know who they are voting for and who is trying to represent them. Manitobans deserve to have their political leaders held to this higher standard of responsibility, and public disclosure is required and will be required by this bill. This legislation will provide Manitobans with information that many of them would like to see. And I think that we can all agree that our leaders, regardless of political affiliation, should be open and honest with the Manitobans they are hoping to serve in public office. I believe this legislation will broaden the openness and maybe even shine a light on the financial actions of leaders of political parties, just like it did when former British Prime Minister David Cameron, who released his income tax returns from the past 7 years when he was in office. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we're certainly at a time where there are more demands for public transparency. You see, in March 2017, I was very fortunate to attend a global meeting of world leaders at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in Paris. At the conclusion of the Anti-Corruption in Politics Conference, I wrote a report on how to create a corrupt-free world by changing the little things, one at a time. One can also review the research by the American Economic Association article titled Disclosure by Politicians, as it shows that public disclosure rather than confidential disclosure is associated with lowering perceived corruption and creating better government. On May 25th, 2021, the current NDP leader stated in the legislature, and I'll quote, "The person that you are on the way is the person that you will become when you sit in the chair," end of quote. This bill will help to highlight the moral character of those in leadership roles and who they were on the way to get there. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this bill is a step in the right direction. It is certainly an opportunity for us to proceed in strengthening the democratic process, creating better accountability, and really making all Manitobans more aware of what we as politicians can bring to the table. Again, it will really be transparent with election season just coming up around the corner. And I'm sure the political parties are already getting ready to spar with each other, the leaders anyways. And I'm sure the question will come out, what was your tax return and why does it look for it? So again, by putting this legislation in place, it will certainly provide an opportunity to level the playing field and to let not just the political parties, but again, Manitobans more aware of the history, the background, the integrity, the honesty, the openness, the fairness, the transparency that needs to come with the government, needs to come with any political party that is representing those who put them there. So with that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I look around the House and I ask for support from all sides. I am generally interested in hearing feedback and inclusion from all parties, and I look forward to this morning's debate. Thank you.
Before we go on to the question period, I just want to clarify, when we started with all the moving parts this morning, I basically said to the government House leader on private members' business. I should have said private members' business and addressed call for the government House leader. So we are in private members' business on private member bill. So just to clarify that and put that in Hansard. So now a question period up to 10 minutes will be held, and questions may be addressed in the following sequence. The first question might be asked by the member from another party. Any subsequent questions may follow a rotation between parties. Each independent member may ask one question, and no questions or answers shall exceed 45 seconds. The honourable member for Notre Dame.
Thank you and good morning, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I appreciate my friend, the member for Brandon East's comments regarding the need for open and transparent ways here in the Manitoba Legislature. And with that in mind, I'd like to ask my friend, will the member for Brandon East call on the current Premier of Manitoba to release his income earned and taxes paid today? Yes or no?
The honourable member for Brandon East.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I thank the honourable member from Notre Dame for that question. It's a great question. And you know, I would say when this bill passes, and if I could have their support, and we get this bill passed, once it goes live, then it's in effect, and all leaders of all parties, and not just in the Manitoba Legislature, the parties that, such as the Communist Party of Canada, the Green Party, the Manitoba First Party, all the party leaders will have to disclose that information.
The honourable member for McPhillips.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'd like to ask the MLA for Brandon East if he can advise why he selected 20 years as a time frame for the disclosure agreement as part of his legislation that he brought forward this morning for us to debate.
The honourable member for Brandon East.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and thank you to the great member from McPhillips. So this legislation will require a party leader to show the whole picture of their financial history, not just the years that they pick and choose after making positive changes. The public will be able to see their financial history from before they were likely even considering running for public office.
The honourable member for St. Boniface.
Yeah, I have to ask, if the member attended an OECD meeting, was he aware of the fact that from 2009 to 2012, Costa Rica was on the OECD blacklist for non-cooperative tax havens, and that it was only moved to a gray list in 2012? I mean, is he aware of the fact, of this fact, that the Premier owns a corporation where he has declared no income from a known blacklisted OECD tax haven?
The honourable member for Brandon East. Member for Brandon East, if you take your mic off mute.
Well, I guess that's $5. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I thank the member for St. Boniface for the question. So when I attended the OECD conference, I worked really close with MLAs from Northern Australia, from Jamaica, and of course there were 895 people at this conference. We spent 3 days talking about ways to prevent corruption, and I'll say Canada is on the, I'm going to say, corruption list at the bottom, anti-corruption at the very top. And of course, there are countries that have more challenges. And I just think with this bill, my intention is to ensure that we remain on top of the anti-corruption piece and not on the bottom where other countries lie.
The honourable member for Notre Dame.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. You know, with my friend, the member from Brandon East, I really do believe that all of us, not just our leaders, have this role to play to make sure that we, you know, try to make our government as open and as transparent as possible. But with that said, you know, I don't think that your leader would agree with this bill. I mean, in the past, he's called this kind of thing being a stunt. So does the member for Brandon East agree with his leader that releasing tax information is a stunt?
The honourable member for Brandon East.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So this bill increases transparency, and it improves and increases it by legislation in the fact that a leader of any political party will have to disclose their taxes that they paid and their income, plus notice of assessments for 20 years. I truly believe a 20-year package is definitely not a stunt. It is something that is, in my opinion, something that we can all aspire to look at to improve openness, transparency in not just government, but in all parties.
The honourable member for Lagimodiere.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and thank the member for Brandon East for introducing this bill. Just a question for him. Would leaders only have to file their disclosure once?
The honourable member for Brandon East.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I thank the member from Lagimodiere for that question. The answer is simple, no. Once a leader of a recognized party has filed a disclosure, they will be required to update the disclosure each year with any new notice of assessments that they receive. This would definitely help ensure that leaders of parties are consistently disclosing their information, and it continues the principles of transparency for Manitobans.
The honourable member for Notre Dame.
Does my friend, the member for Brandon East, think that it was wrong for the Premier and the PC leader to refuse to release his income and tax information in the 2016 election?
The honourable member for Brandon East.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and again, thank you for the question from my friend from Notre Dame. So again, there's a reason I'm bringing this bill forward. And as I said, when my experience in not just running in elections, but volunteering for elections, the previous 4 elections, we've always had, in my opinion, political involvement, political leaders challenging and sparring other candidate hopefuls for leadership in releasing their information. This bill, Bill 237, would eliminate that, and all leaders of all registered political parties in the province of Manitoba will have to comply.
The honourable member for Rossmere. The member for Rossmere can unmute his mic. Oh, it's not, okay. I'm going to then call on the honourable member for McPhillips.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, through you, I'd like to ask my colleague, the member for Brandon East, about this legislation, whether or not it'll impact only those political parties that currently have elected members in the legislature, or does it apply to any other political parties here in Manitoba? Thank you.
The honourable member for Brandon East.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and again, thank you to my friend from McPhillips. So again, this legislation will be enacted to all political parties that are registered with Elections Manitoba in the province of Manitoba. So for example, I think I mentioned a few of them before, but we do have the Communist Party of Canada, the Green Party, Manitoba First, the Manitoba Liberal Party, the Manitoba Party, the New Democrat Party of Manitoba, and the Progressive Conservative Party of Manitoba.
The honourable member for Notre Dame.
Does the member for Brandon East think it was wrong that the PC leader refused to reveal his income taxes as the leader of the opposition did in 2017?
The honourable member for Brandon East.
Again, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I want to look forward, and if there are issues with the sparring of leaders and releasing their information, whether that was 2008 or 2016, whenever that happened, this is current. This bill, when passed, will eliminate that. There will be no need for that question in the future, because every leader from every political party in Manitoba will already meet these obligations in order to fulfill their obligation as leader of their designated party.
The honourable member for Lagimodiere.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And the bill states that the party leaders will need to go back 20 years or until the age of 18. I was just curious why exempts income earned before the age of 18. Thank you.
The honourable member for Brandon East.
So thank you again, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and thanks to my friend from Lagimodiere. That's a good question. When we look though at the age of 18, the age of 18 is considered the age of, I'm going to say adulthood, with a number of items in Manitoba, such as alcohol and gambling and things like that. So we look at the age, at least I look at the age of 18 being the transition period into adult life. And the bill is designed to create that adult life moving forward. As a young man, for example, I washed dishes for my first job in a restaurant. That would not come into play because I was 16 years old at the time. But once I turned 18, if I was aspiring, which I'm not, to be a leader of any political party, then I would disclose information.
Honourable member's time is up. And the time for question period has expired. Debate is open. The honourable member for Notre Dame.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Bill 237 is the Elections Amendment Act. The purpose of this bill is to amend the Elections Act to require the disclosure of personal financial information by the leader of a political party for a 20-year period. This bill would require the leader to file with the Chief Electoral Officer a statement disclosing their total income and the income taxes they paid as an adult, as well as any tax notices that they received. The leader's statements about their income and taxes must be made public by the Chief Electoral Officer. In our opinion on this side of this House, this bill sends a clear message that the PC party is out of touch with regular Manitobans. And I say that because we're right in the middle of a third wave, and this is the best that the PC party can put forward. And I believe that Manitobans deserve so much better than this failed and tired PC party. One of the questions I would have liked to ask if we had more time from the member from Brandon East is, in his opinion, or just from, just working in his constituency office, what are the top 3, top 5 issues that constituents are coming to him with? What are their main problems? What are things that he can help them with? If he could do anything for them, the top 3, top 5 priorities from constituents. I know what mine are in my constituency, and certainly putting forward a bill like this wouldn't be one of the top 3 or top 5 issues for my constituents at this time. We're in the middle of a third wave. We're seeing record unemployment numbers. We're seeing a situation where we're not even able to take care of our own folks here in this province. And instead we're engaging in a bill that is going towards American style politics and more leader bashing and things of that sort. Bill 237 would require leaders of all political parties to disclose their total income, income taxes paid as an adult, and tax notices received for the past 20 years. This in and of itself is a little bit bizarre because the CRA requires individuals to keep their tax information for only 7 years. So 20 years seems to be an arbitrary requirement. The member is talking about stuff about being 18 years old in adulthood. It's really looking for any kind of hole now. Like obviously this is something, it's going to be like another attack on the member for Fort Rouge, looking for things because maybe he's doing such a good job right now that we need to find more things to attack him about for. So it's a bill that is a stark example of PC hypocrisy. Why would a PC member bring forward a bill that their leader wouldn't even follow? The series of questions I asked about the member for, I think he's Fort White, the premier, would he be okay with releasing his tax information? He's called it a stunt. He refused to release his tax information in 2016. He didn't do that in 2017. He didn't do that in 2019. So this is something that even his own leader wouldn't be able to do when called upon to do so. So he's called, the premier has called the release for taxes to be reminiscent of American style politics. He's rejected that. The premier has called the idea of releasing taxes in an election campaign a distraction from the real issues that matter to families. And, the PC party stated at the time, quote, Greg Selinger's last minute election stunt is desperate, American style politics from an old, tired government trying to divert voters' attention from the real issues that matter to families. That was from a CBC article on April 10th, 2016. The premier throughout the pandemic has been constantly deflecting from the real issues and blaming everyone, including people like the President of the United States, everyone except himself. And here's a fact. The leader of the official opposition is the only current party leader who has revealed both his income and taxes paid, which he did in 2017. The intent of the bill is clear. It's meant to perpetuate a racist myth about Indigenous people in Canada, that they don't pay taxes. We've seen, this kind of race baiting here in this legislature with the different kinds of bills that have been introduced. And I mean, I used to live in Sage Creek, and during the last election, and had to drive by drive through Lagimodier and see this big billboard during the last election. It had the member for Fort Rouge in a headdress, and it was a big billboard paid for by the PC party, and it was saying something like, "Oh, is this the kind of leader that you would want?" So there is this type of Indigenous race baiting that we're seeing here, and I believe that this bill is another type of race baiting, another type of leader bashing, and there's this racist myth that Indigenous people in Canada don't pay taxes, and here's another bill that's going to try to prove that, but you'll be wrong. In fact, it's your leader that's not paying taxes. The premier likes to claim he always pays his taxes, but we know that's not true. We've learned over the years that the premier did not pay the taxes he was legally required to pay on his luxury villa in where. I don't want to have to make the my friend, the member for Brandon East, to pay another $5. He broke the laws of where, and then threatened to sue the Winnipeg Free Press for bringing it to light. He never apologized to the Free Press for threatening to sue them, even when they were proven right. Then just this year, we found out that the premier has been taking advantage of an application-only amnesty program to lower his bill even more. The taxes the premier dodged were meant to support housing programs for the poor in where, and he failed to pay his taxes on his luxury villa for over a decade. It was only because of the reporting of the Free Press did the premier's breach of the law come to light. This bill appears to exclude monies held in trusts and corporations from disclosure, which means a substantial portion of the premier's personal interests will be kept in the dark. Bolster Investment Holdings 22 Corporation holds property, stocks, and other income-generated assets that the premier has an interest in, yet this would be excluded from the required information for disclosure under this bill. This bill was not included in the recent changes the government made to the Conflict of Interest Act for members and leaders of recognized parties in this chamber. And this bill is a hypocritical attack from a party whose leader has repeatedly refused to comply with the very standard that this bill sets. It's ridiculous to think that this is this government's priority. Manitobans everywhere are still fighting through the third wave of this pandemic. I would urge my friend, the member for Brandon East, and my friends on the opposite side of the aisle to really consider their constituents and the members, and other Manitobans, the priorities of Manitobans right now, and to withdraw this bill immediately and instead focus on those constituents, on those Manitobans and their needs, and why we're here in this office in the first place, to bring those concerns forward, not to keep perpetuating this type of these types of American-style politics that this bill would actually bring forth. If the Premier himself would like to release his income and tax information, such as the leader of the official opposition has done, he can do so at any time without legislation. Let's keep this space here for legislation that's actually important to bring forth the priorities of Manitobans. Other negative changes made to the election laws recently, there have been many that affect democracy in a negative way. We know that Manitobans value the principles of democracy, and they expect their elected officials to uphold the principles of free and fair elections. Fixed election dates keep our government accountable, and a blackout on government advertising leading up to provincial elections is an integral part of our democratic process. But this government has now passed Bill 32, and it was a bill whose main purpose was to help the PCs gain political favor during the next election. So that's not a very open, transparent, and democratic bill that they passed. Bill 32 shortens the advertising restriction period for a fixed date election from 90 days to 60 days. It also amends restrictions on advertising before a vote on a referendum, shortening the restriction
The
period.
honourable member's time is up. The honourable member for McPhillips.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And I want to start by acknowledging that we are gathered on the ancestral lands of the Treaty 1 territory, traditional land of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Dakota, and the Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I wanted to start with that out of respect and acknowledgement of the 215 lives lost at the Kamloops residential school. Mr. Deputy Speaker, when I came to the legislature this morning and passed the children's shoes and teddy bears and such on here at the steps of the legislature, and knowing that I had the opportunity this morning to speak in the House, I knew I had to take this opportunity and comment and express my solidarity with my colleagues in this legislature to make sure that these young lives are remembered, acknowledged, and most important of all, action is taken to ensure that never again can we have something like this happen here in Canada. It's truly a heart-wrenching situation. I give complete applause to the Kamloops First Nation. I won't embarrass myself by trying to pronounce their traditional name, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I know they took advantage of culturally appropriate methods when surveying the properties, Mr. Deputy Speaker, using ground penetrating radar and such, but obviously to make sure that the situation was handled in a most appropriate way, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So I had that opportunity, Mr. Deputy Speaker, when I saw those shoes this morning, and like I said, I just knew that I wanted to share my condolences and know that there's still a lot of other children out there that still need to come home Mr. Deputy Speaker. I know when I was rereading the Truth and Reconciliation Commission last night, I was reading a section by Dr. Scott Hamilton from the Lakehead University. He's with the Department of Anthropology there, and he wrote an article within the TRC called "Where Are the Children Buried?" And in it, he noted that at least 3,213 children died over the 140 years of residential schools, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and obviously we know and suspect that many more fell victim to those schools, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So we need to work together to ensure again, that all those children are brought home, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, we are here again virtually. I know that the numbers in the legislature have been pared down more as Manitobans continue to battle the third wave. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I look forward to that opportunity when the virtual component is eliminated and we can once again sit and talk face to face, Mr. Deputy Speaker, because again, while I think we need to applaud and herald yourself, the Deputy Speaker, and of course the Speaker, for all your efforts in ensuring a seamless virtual democracy. It is still virtual, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and nothing can ever eliminate or mitigate the personal component, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So to that end, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I encourage all of us, all members and all Manitobans to make sure that they continue to follow good COVID practices, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that they're wearing a mask, that they're social distancing and physically distancing from others, that they're following the social restrictions being put forward by Shared Health, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that they're washing hands, and most important of all—
Point of order, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
On a member for St. Boniface. On a point of order.
There's just a little bit of question of relevance to the debate here, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Perhaps the member from Rick Phillips could stick to the point.
The Honourable Government House Leader. On the same point of order.
On the same point of order, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think that, given the acknowledgement that the member was making on the tragedy in Canada that has been discovered, I would think that there would be some degree of grace and latitude by the leader of the Liberal Party for the very poignant and important comments that I think all members, given the opportunity, want to put on the record.
The Honourable Opposition House Leader. On the same point of order.
You know, typically we don't all agree in this chamber, but I would suggest that if the member for McPhillips wants to put some words on the record, that is his right, particularly at this moment in our collective history. And I will just say this, I don't think that Indigenous peoples need the member for St. Boniface to speak on our behalf. We can do so if we need. Miigwech.
On that point of order, in this case, it's not a point of order, but, oh, sorry, just 1 second. What I will do is encourage all members to bring the relevance of the bill back into the as relevance, and like I said, this wouldn't constitute as a point of order. It is at certain times that we're dealing with. It's important too, but I would encourage all members to be relevant when it comes to the bill that we're talking about. The honour member for McPhillips.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker, for those sage observations. And to the leader of the Liberal Party, I'm not going to apologize for expressing my solidarity and condolences with the families of those 215 children who never got to go home, Mr. Deputy Speaker. When we talked about, when I was talking about vaccinations, Mr. Speaker, we know that the BIPOC community, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is disproportionately being impacted by the third wave, Mr. Deputy Speaker, not unlike children of Aboriginal descent, Mr. Deputy Speaker, who were disproportionately affected by previous pandemics during their time in residential schools. The tuberculosis pandemic, for example, had a devastating impact on children in residential schools, resulting in bodies literally being piled up in the wintertime because there was no place to store them, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think it's incumbent on all of us as legislatures to stand up and acknowledge our history, and the history of which part of our country and our parliamentary democracy is built upon. It's built upon the bones of these children, their lives, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So again, if the member for St. Boniface, if the leader of the Little Party is so outraged that one could share feelings or share, I don't know, like I said, share their thoughts on the revelation that horrified Canada, I'm not sure what to say, Mr. Deputy Speaker. But Mr. Deputy Speaker, back to your original comments, Mr. Deputy Speaker, about ensuring focus. It is to that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I want to thank you as we wind down this legislative session, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Thank you, and through you, thank the clerks, the pages, and everyone else, Mr. Deputy Speaker, who has made this virtual Parliament and this virtual legislature happen. It couldn't have occurred without your good work, that of your staff, and everyone around you, and of course the participation of all my colleagues here who have made an effort to ensure that despite the health conditions that we're under, despite the health criteria and restrictions, that we continue to ensure that democracy is served here in Manitoba. We've seen other jurisdictions here in Canada. I look out west, I believe Alberta actually had to shut down their legislature, Mr. Deputy Speaker. But here in Manitoba, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I think right now, if memory serves me right, I believe there's a total of maybe 4 or 5 people within the actual chamber right now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, but I have no doubt that symbolism is of utmost importance, and it's the symbolism of legislation like that we are debating today. Why we are here, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It is that opportunity to bring forward a private member's bill that is incumbent upon all of us as legislators, as members of the legislature of Manitoba. We each have that opportunity to bring forward legislation, to bring forward ideas that we hear from the citizens and constituents back in our home communities. And in this case, the member for Brandon East has listened to his constituents. He has reflected on the meetings.
Again, I will just remind the member for McPhillips to get back to the relevance of the bill. The honour member for McPhillips.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And as I was noting, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I was tying in the member's legislation this morning and his previous involvement with some international anti-corruption meetings that were held he had referenced that had involved jurisdictions from as far away as Australia to Jamaica, and that is where the impetus of this legislation that he brought forward comes from, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I just, on those very few brief words, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I want to thank again. I want to thank the member for Brandon East for participating in the democratic process, for sharing this legislation with us, with the House today, so that we have an opportunity to have that debate and have that discussion. I listened carefully to the comments from the member for Notre Dame, and I have no doubt that the member for Brandon East will take those comments into consideration as the bill continues to move forward through this debate that we're having here this morning, and more importantly, as it is voted on, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and ultimately brought forward a committee stage, so we can have Manitobans come forward and share their comments on the member for Brandon East's proposal that he has brought forward on this day, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And so again, with those few brief comments, Mr. Deputy Speaker, again, my heart and my prayers go out to the families of the 215 children. It is our national shame, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and to that I acknowledge the privilege that I have, that my children have, and that we all have as legislators, to participate in the parliamentary process. So again, a blessed summer to all my colleagues. Stay safe and thank you.
The honour member's time is up. The honour member for Wolseley.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. This bill amends the Elections Act to require the disclosure of personal financial information by the leader of a political party for a 20-year period. Bill 237 would require leaders of all political parties to disclose their total income, income taxes paid as an adult, and tax notices received for the past 20 years. This in itself is bizarre. The CRA requires individuals to keep their tax information for only 7 years, so 20 years is arbitrary and punitive requirement. This bill is a stark example of PC hypocrisy. Why would a PC member bring forward a bill that their leader won't even follow? In 2016, the Premier refused to release his taxes when called upon to do so in that election. He called the idea of releasing his taxes a stunt. He said calls to release taxes were reminiscent of American-style politics, which he rejected. And he called the idea of releasing taxes in an election campaign a distraction from the real issues that mattered to families. Do you think there might be some other real issues going on right now that matter to families? The PC party stated at the time, Greg Selinger's last-minute election stunt is desperate, American-style politics from an old, tired government trying to divert voters' attention from the real issues that matter to families. Well, we're hearing from an old, tired government now, aren't we, Mr. Deputy Speaker? On May 13th, it was reported by the CBC, and I'm reading verbatim here, so I hope that it's okay to include proper names of members of this House. The CBC reported that
there's no like the advisement to the member is to make sure that if you're making comments, even in quotes and in papers and stuff, that you still use the member's constituency or position's name. The honourable member for Wolseley.
Thank you. Manitoba Premier insinuated the leader of the Manitoba NDP committed tax evasion before backtracking Thursday at a news conference where he was once again questioned on his taxes. The Premier tried to shift the focus from his own taxes to those of the NDP leader after CBC News reported Thursday the Premier received a tax break on money he owed the Costa Rican government. He didn't disclose the tax amnesty when he showed proof he paid his taxes in 2019, end quote. The article went on to quote the Premier saying, he, referencing the leader of the opposition, hasn't given any evidence that he paid his taxes, end quote. Like much of what we have heard out of the Premier's mouth through the media this year, this is a ridiculous accusation with no grounding in reality. In 2017, during a leadership race, the now leader of the official opposition was asked to produce his tax returns, and he did so. As reported by CBC, and I quote, the leader of the opposition was never accused publicly of failing to pay his taxes, as Pallister wrongly suggested on Thursday, end quote.
I just want to remind the member, again, not to use a person's last name, use their title or their constituency name. The honourable member for Wolseley.
My apologies, as the Premier wrongly suggested on Thursday, end quote. Given that this Premier has been adamant about refusal to release his taxes, this PMB introduced at this time is a very strong indicator that the Premier will be stepping down soon. In fact, I would say it's very clear his caucus members are more than eager to have him step down from his role, or why would they bring forward a bill that basically ensures he won't run again, and is in fact maybe getting set to run away sooner rather than later. It's a strong message from that caucus. They do not want a leader who has refused to release his taxes and has found ways around paying his tax bills in other countries and then didn't disclose that information. This is a fact. The leader of the official opposition is the only current party leader who has revealed both his income and taxes paid, which he did when called on to do so in 2017. And I will remind the Premier that if he would like to release his income and tax information, such as the leader of the official opposition has done, he can do so at any time without legislation. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the intent of this bill is clear. It is meant to perpetuate a racist myth about Indigenous people in Canada that don't pay taxes. Just this morning, the member for McPhillips invoked the memory of the children who were killed in Indian residential schools, and we have heard many comments from the other side of the House about the seriousness of this issue and the collective grief and collective responsibility of Canadians. But colonialism is not just something in our past. Racist myths and racist policies policies continue, and they continue in this legislature. The best way that members in this legislature can express their empathy and outrage about the crimes of this country's past is by deleting our racist policies one by one, starting with this bill. Today is Indigenous Peoples Day. It's a day we recognize and honor the achievements, histories, and rich culture of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people in Canada. Yet here we are actually debating a bill based on a common racist stereotype about Indigenous people, only weeks after the Premier falsely accused the Indigenous leader of the opposition of that very thing. The facts are that personal tax exemption occurs only in specific, well-defined cases, and Indigenous people pay significant amounts of tax every year. Inuit and Métis people always pay taxes. First Nations people without status and registered First Nations people living off reserves pay taxes like the rest of the country. Registered First Nations people working off reserve pay income tax regardless of where they reside. Registered First Nations people are sometimes exempted from paying personal taxes as part of the federal government's statutory obligation as outlined in the Indian Act. And there are many taxes beyond personal income taxes on corporations and unincorporated businesses, federal and provincial sales tax, and federal excise taxes. Based on data from 2016, Indigenous people in Manitoba contributed over $230 million in taxes annually. So let's put this racist myth to rest and not further perpetrate it here in the legislature. In addition to building on the racist myths about Indigenous people and taxes with its call for 20 years of tax records, this bill is targeting those who have lived in poverty, those who've been unemployed, or even those who have made mistakes in their past. Reaching back to the age of 18 or 20 years in the past is a long reach that does not allow for anyone who has struggled financially in their past or made mistakes with CRA to ever be in a significant public role 20 years into the future. This targets marginalized people in general and anyone who's not had the benefit of taxation education or support at a young age. Let's not forget all the ways that people with wealth find ways to not pay their fair share if they don't want to. For example, the Premier likes to claim he always pays his taxes, but we already know that's not true. And when he broke the taxation laws of Costa Rica and was discovered, he threatened to sue the Winnipeg Free Press for bringing it to light. He has never apologized to the Free Press for this threat, even when they were proven right. And then last year, we found out he's been taking advantage of an application-only amnesty program to lower his bill even more. The taxes the Premier dodged were meant to support housing programs for the poor in Costa Rica, and he failed to pay these taxes on his luxury villa for over 10 years. This bill appears to exclude monies held in trusts and corporations from disclosure, which means a substantial portion of the Premier's personal interests will be kept in the dark. Pallister Investment Holdings 22 Corporation owns property, stocks, and other income, generating assets that the Premier has an interest in, yet this would be excluded from the required information for disclosure under this bill. This bill was not included in the recent changes the government made to the Conflict of Interest Act for members and leaders of recognized parties in this chamber. It is a hypocritical attack from a party whose leader has repeatedly refused to comply with the standard this bill sets. It's ridiculous to think that this is the government's priority, and Manitobans everywhere are still fighting through the third wave of this pandemic.
Order. In accordance with Rule 24, as previously announced, I am now interrupting this debate to put the question of second reading of Bill 237, the Elections Amendment Act. Is it the pleasure of the House to adopt the motion? I hear no. All those in favor of the motion, please say yay. Yay. All those opposed, please say nay. Nay. In my opinion, the yeas have it. The Honorable Opposition House Leader.
Deputy Speaker, a recorded vote, please.
A recorded vote having been requested, I must advise the House that according to Rule 23(7), a division during the private members' hour on Tuesday must be deferred to the private members' hour the following Thursday. Accordingly, this recorded vote shall be deferred until 11:55 a.m. on the next Thursday when the House is sitting. It's considered private members' business. So it'll be after probably the 6th of October. So, but I got the right date. So now the Honorable Government House Leader.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, could you canvass the House to see if it's the will of members to call at 11 a.m.?
Is it will of the House to call the hour 11 p.m.? A.m. 11 a.m. We're adjourned. No, the honourable member, the hour being 11 p.m. A.m. Sorry, 11 a.m. It's so early in the morning. The private members bill debate is now closed, and we're going on to private members resolution. And the resolution today is in the name of the honourable member of Borderland. The honourable member for Borderland. Is he on the screen? The honourable member for Borderland.
My apologies, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Perfect. Let me get my text here. I move, seconded by the honourable member for Riding Mountain. Therefore, be it resolved that the Legislative Assembly of Manitoba call on the federal government to improve and revise their journalism subsidy program to enable more rural, northern, and community newspapers to be eligible for the program and help them continue to provide the valuable services to Manitobans.
It has been moved by the honourable member for Borderland, seconded by the honourable member for Riding Mountain. Therefore be resolved that the Legislative Assembly of Manitoba call on the federal government to improve and revise their journalism subsidy program to enable more rural, northern, and community newspapers to be eligible for the program and help them continue to provide the valuable services to Manitobans. The honourable member for Borderland.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise virtually in the chamber today to introduce this motion. It's an important resolution and strives to support our hardworking, often mom and pop operations at our local community newspapers, trusted sources of information in especially rural Manitoba, and especially in these times where we are dealing with obviously, we've all heard the term fake news, and there's an erosion of trust in institutions generally, and in the media, and in various outlets, and there's a hyper politicization of news these days. People more than ever need reliable sources of information, and community newspapers are exactly that. And local newspapers are an integral part of any community. They help new businesses get started. By getting the word out. They generate their own advertising revenue, often at lower rates than the larger dailies. They keep local politicians accountable. They serve as a voice. Their comment boards are often very interesting to read, and I always look forward to Thursday every week when I get to read my local papers and read the perspectives of folks in my community on the issues that they're talking about. And so locals really do serve to provide that trusted source of information at the local level. And I think it's important that we do all we can to support them. I think it's disappointing that the federal journalism subsidy fails to support these local newspapers, and so I'll go into a little more detail on that. So basically, the 2019 federal 2019 budget introduced the journalism subsidy. So it's a $595 million package divided between 3 initiatives. And the first and most costly is a labor tax credit to bolster the salaries of working journalists. Qualified Canadian journalism organizations will be able to claim a 25% refundable tax credit on the salaries of eligible workers, subject to a cap of $55,000 for a maximum tax credit of $13,750 per employee. The second initiative will allow not-for-profit news organizations to apply for charitable status, allowing them to receive donations and issue tax receipts to donors. But the media fund doesn't just apply to the journalists, plus the big news lists that employ them. Canadians who pay did claim a 15% tax credit for a maximum of $75 per year for subscriptions purchased from January 2020 onwards. One of the things that is also a matter of concern, I think, is that to receive some of this money, you have to be qualified. An organization has to go, for an outlet has to be qualified as a qualified, just looking for the term here. It's a qualified Canadian journalism organization. And I guess that designation is handed out or applied by an advisory panel that is established by the government. And my understanding is that definition is still being determined. So at the end of the day, what's troubling though is that the QCJO designation, Qualified Canadian Journalism Organization designation, applies to with the Winnipeg Free Press, Winnipeg Sun, Brandon Sun, the Carillon. These are all papers that are able to access federal subsidies, and yet we have local papers in rural Manitoba that and across Manitoba that fail to qualify. And so what you see is what we saw last year, I believe, with Post Media shutting down 15 local papers, which was a huge blow to rural Manitoba. And I'm especially concerned as a representative of an area where vaccine uptake is too low, and where we're doing all we can to try to encourage people to take the vaccine. You know, local papers, as I've seen, I've been very appreciative of the fact that they've been carrying perspectives and testimonies, and you know, getting doctors on the record and getting the facts on the record with that, through that local perspective, that local lens that helps people at a local level better understand in their own language, you know, what it means to get the vaccine, and better explain and unpack some of the issues that we're going through, and to not have that local voice is a great loss. And so, as I said, with the shuttering of the 15 papers across Manitoba by Post Media, we were blessed as a local community to have the South Central Post come into being through the resilience and determination and hard work of local journalists, and so we now are blessed with a great paper that carries, is a trusted source of some of this great news, and is an important voice, again, on things like vaccine hesitancy and encouraging people to get the vaccine. So it's important that we have these local sources of information, but it's important that they be supported, because again, as I said, they're often mom and pop shops, or they have 2 or 3, maybe 1 reporter on staff, 2 or 3 people working at the paper. And as I said, they charge significantly lower rates for their advertising revenue. It's all, you know, done through their own effort, really, and they're supported by the local community, and they in turn support the local community, and yet they're left on the outside. So it is something that needs to be addressed. The problem with the federal program for newspapers is that it only includes, as I said, news organizations that have an online subscription and charge a fee to access this service. Many of the valuable community newspapers offer their paper for free or do not have an online subscription option, and this makes them ineligible. The only papers in Manitoba that are eligible for the benefit are, as I said, the Winnipeg Free Press, the Carillon, the Winnipeg Sun, and the Brandon Sun. So community newspapers, as they touched on, are facing a real risk of shutting down, and the federal government has created an incentive program that only helps drive subscriptions to large conglomerate news chains. And this is, again, very serious, as I said, as we're talking about, we live in the age of fake news and vaccine hesitancy and all the rest of it. To not have, you know, to have some of these local papers struggling right now is a real problem. Canada's federal government announced plans in 2019 for 3 initiatives to support Canadian journalism. As I said, it's $595 million. The federal government's own panel of advisors, interestingly, indicated that this program alone will not be enough to prevent the disappearance of many essential sources of information, especially small local news media outlets that are not covered by the Budget 2019 measures and that are extremely vulnerable, and that other programs should be considered. I'm just going to share a couple stats here as well. So it's estimated that foreign-owned digital media such as Google and Facebook will take $7 billion in advertising out of the Canadian economy this year. That's astounding, $7 billion to Google and Facebook. Daily newspaper ad revenues are half what they were a decade ago. More than 250 Canadian news outlets have closed in the past decade. 1/3 of journalism jobs disappeared in Canada over a 6-year span. And foreign-owned digital companies are not funding the creation of Canadian news in any significant way, despite benefiting from the work done by traditional news outlets. The federal government's own advisory panel shared as well that the tax credits program, as positive as it is, will not suffice to counter these disastrous effects. They said that they've made a number of recommendations to improve the program and to further help written journalism organizations, especially smaller outlets and those representing minority, language, and ethnic communities. These publications, print and digital, are vital to their many readers and are often the only independent news media serving a community, and most do not qualify for existing government assistance programs. So local and community-based newspapers are essential, and yet they are neglected from these federal programs. Local news sources cover issues specific to communities they serve. They're one of the last sources of reliable information available to people about what their government is up to and keeping them accountable. The requirements set out, many of these papers are free and distributed openly. And so I think the issue is fairly clear here. Mr. Deputy Speaker, my apologies for the interruptions here, but I am pleased to submit
the
this
honourable
resolution.
member's time has expired. A question period of up to 10 minutes will be held, and questions may be addressed in the following sequence. The first question may be asked by a member from another party. Any subsequent questions must follow a rotation between parties. Each independent member may ask one question, and no question or answer shall exceed 45 seconds. The member for Concordia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'd like to ask the member, was he present at the caucus meeting where his party decided to end the requirement for government to provide public notice in local newspapers?
The member for Borderland.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I invite the member for Concordia maybe to be a little more specific. I think if he's referencing Bill 8, good government listens, and I think he'll find that if he goes back and checks the record, we listened and we made amendments.
The member for Portage La Prairie.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And there are some great new local news organizations out there that have been excluded from the federal plan, especially the local ones. I'm wondering if the member would like to comment on their on the ability for these local organizations to get access for funding in the future.
The member for Borderland.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I thank the member for Portage La Prairie for the question. He's absolutely right. We have a lot of great papers in our area, and of course, he's a rural member as well, representing Portage La Prairie and understands the importance of local papers and the importance of them accessing the same help that the large dailies in this province do. So we want to keep local journalism alive, and it's important that the federal government expand their program to be able to do that.
The member for St. Boniface.
Thank you very much. I'm a little surprised that the seconder on this motion is the owner of a string of newspapers in rural Manitoba, which has received support from the Government of Canada. Can a member for Borderlands explain why we're calling on the federal government to do something and why this government isn't just doing something to help?
The member for Borderland.
Yeah, there's a number of directions we could go with that, I guess. You know, it's the federal government's program, and you know, I mean, they've got financial tools that we obviously don't. They've got clearly bags of money that we don't have here in Manitoba, in Manitoba, and in the provinces across Canada don't have. And so it's interesting that they would leave out local newspapers and only subsidize the hyper-political large organizations flush with reporters and 36 members on their staff and that sort of thing. So
the member's time has expired. The member for Concordia.
I appreciate that the member confirmed he supported Bill 8. Did the member question the minister when he repeatedly misled this House with regards to Bill 53, which just passed a few weeks ago, which also removed the requirement for notices for municipalities for upcoming meetings with regards to advertising in local newspapers?
The member for Borderland.
Yeah, I think the important thing is that the member for Concordia and members opposite join us in demonstrating support for local papers, local journalism. You know, as I said, we're dealing with fake news and vaccine hesitancy and all the rest of it, and it's important that we support our local papers. You know, the internet is a reality as well, and it's here to stay. And so, if he wants to go back and relitigate legislation that's been before the House, you know, we can do that. But this resolution is about supporting local papers.
The member for Waverley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just wondering, I know I've been to rural Manitoba through my role as Special Envoy for Military Affairs, and I appreciate the coverage that they gave me when I did my Summer Legion tour. Do these organizations that are eligible for the federal support program adequately serve your community and the needs of all Manitobans?
The member for Borderland.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I thank my friend, the member for Waverley, for the question. And yes, community-based newspapers are a key part of any community, as they as I said, help to you know, get the word out as small businesses you know, get started. It's an opportunity for them to get the word out and post advertising at lower rates, and they're effective because people in communities do read the local paper, and of course it's local. It's kind of got the same effect as people going to you know, Facebook or social media and you know, sharing perspectives and that sort of thing. The local paper really is an important and trusted source of information for a lot of these folks.
The member's time has expired. The member for Concordia.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Exactly did the member say to the Premier when he, unprompted, spoke out directly against these federal subsidies that the member is now advocating for? When the member or the First Minister seemed to imply that journalists would not be impartial if they received these federal subsidies, did he pull the Premier aside and chastise him at that point?
The member for Borderland.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. you know, I thank the member for Concordia for the question. I'm a little bit surprised, though, that he isn't at least somewhat troubled by the prospect of losing more local community newspapers. But then again, you'll never see an NDP member in rural Manitoba. At least historically, it's not been the case. So, you know, of course, this is perhaps an issue that exists outside the perimeter, and therefore they care a little about that.
The member for Portage La Prairie.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'm wondering if the member would care to comment on why he believes that the federal plan really just supports a selected few large organizations and not the broad base of local community.
The member for Borderland.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I thank my friend, the member for Portage La Prairie, for that great question. I think the House should know that the Winnipeg Free Press has received $6.2 million under this program. That's an astounding sum of money. You know, a lot of the local weekly or bi-weekly papers in rural Manitoba, you know, aren't able to access that kind of help because they're excluded, because as I said, they don't have an online presence or they don't have a subscription service. Many of them are offered free, but the work that they do is great, and it's the same as anywhere else. I mean, why would a rural reporter outlet not be supported in the same way that a lot of the large hyper politicized ones are? $6.2 million for the Winnipeg.
The member's time has expired. The member for Concordia.
I take it from the member's previous answer that he didn't speak to the Premier and he didn't pull him aside. Did he also sit quietly by when his party sent out an email implying that the Winnipeg Free Press was fake news and that it was something that needed to be fought, and use that as a fundraising tool? Did he speak up to his party and to his Premier at that point?
The member for Borderland.
Yeah, I'd invite the member for Concordia to get on board. We're dealing with vaccine hesitancy in the province. We're dealing with a historic pandemic, and the vaccines are going to get us back to our normal lives and help mitigate loss of life and suffering and our hospital crisis. And we need people to take the vaccines. We need local trusted sources of information to be able to carry that message out. You know, the bigger dailies are the bigger dailies, and they're political and all that. They have a role to play, and that's fine. But we need our local trusted sources of information to be able to carry the news out about encouraging folks to get the vaccine. And how can they do that if they're struggling and not receiving support under this program? Why are they left out?
The member's time has expired. The Minister of Advanced Education, Skills and Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to ask the member from Borderland, what would the loss of the community paper in your local area and in other rural areas mean for you and other representatives' areas?
The member for Borderland.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend, the minister. It would just be devastating. I think we would lose our, you know, we went through a period of that where we didn't have a paper locally, and there is a sense of loss of local, you know, a local voice. You lose an important avenue for people to be able to give voice to issues and perspectives and share the happenings and the goings on in the community. It's a significant loss for a lot of these communities, and helps to, you know, this feeling of detachment and isolation.
The member's time has expired. Time for questions has expired. The floor is open for debate. The member for Concordia.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to put a few words on the record and to push back on this particular resolution before the House. You know, this is a perfect example of the post-truth party that this member belongs to. It's increasingly becoming clear that the party that the member represents, and that all members in the chamber sit in lockstep with, is increasingly, having a disconnect between their words and their actions. They feel that they can say whatever they want. In this case, that they support local newspapers, and yet the actions of this government clearly show that they do not support local newspapers. In fact, it is the official opposition that has continually stood up time and time and time again to push back and to fight for those local newspapers and the right that they have and the responsibility they have to represent the local voice. This member, in his answers to my questions, refused to let the House know what he said to the Premier when this exact funding that this resolution speaks to was released by the federal government. The Premier came out completely unprompted, speaking to media, and said that he was worried about the independence of journalists. He felt that they would be compromised if they had part of their paycheck covered by Ottawa. The Premier came out to the media and said, quote, "How easy will it be for the media to criticize anybody else or any group that is in receipt of federal funding in years ahead? It would seem that there'd be a crisis of principle at that point in time, and that there'd be a natural reluctance to criticize the hand that is feeding one's organization." So this is the Premier that this member supports, that all members opposite support, who's coming out and questioning journalists in a time when trust in media is at an all-time low because of the actions of parties just like the Premier's. He continues to attack the media over and over and over again. The member opposite talks about vaccine hesitancy. This is a major issue in his constituency. I invite him to become active on that issue, to speak out and speak up about that. But his own Premier and his own party continually call into question the role of the media. The Premier argued that journalists may feel a quote, sense of obligation or perceived sense of duty to the government that funds them. The Premier has to know that journalists in this province and across the world have a code of conduct and take their responsibility and their role in our democracy seriously. And yet the Premier continues to question. He did so when he questioned the reporters in the Free Press who reported on a factual story about Costa Rica and about his tax bill there, which, despite what the Premier would like to have happen, is a story that's not going away and is part of his legacy to this province, where he walks away from his tax obligations elsewhere and then rigs it in his own favor here in his own province. This Premier actually, suggested that he would sue, or did sue, the Winnipeg Free Press, unbelievably, and for a story that was turned out to be completely factual and completely true. The Premier said that they required them to print an apology on the front page of its Saturday paper, and that this apology would be accompanied by a photo that the Premier would choose himself, and that the newspaper and its reporters would be required to reveal their sources of their story. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that we may expect from Donald Trump in the United States, but Manitobans here reject that kind of talk and reject that kind of attitude towards our local newspapers. So where was the member when the Premier was saying this? Where was the member when his party sent out an email, a fundraising letter to their supporters, calling the Winnipeg Free Press fake news, suggesting that it was fake news, and using the language that the free press, the free media, needed to be fought? I mean, this is the kind of stuff that I think most Manitobans would reject if they knew what this government was up to. But you have members here who continue to use language of, we support local journalism, we support local newspapers, yet their actions are clear that they don't. The fundraising letter in question said Manitobans and, quote, most news outlets, understand and value the importance of fairness, balance, especially at a time when there is so much misinformation out there. So is this the misinformation that local journalists are doing? Is that what the fundraising letter was referring to? It talked about how biased reporters were against this government, as if their own failures weren't fodder enough to write the plethora of articles that have pointed out all the ways that they have failed Manitobans. And then, as I said, the letter conclude by asking their supporters to make a donation so that they can, quote, fight back. Fight back. After what we saw in the United States, the big lie, January 6th, insurrection, this government continues to use language like fight back against journalists here in this province. It's sickening. It's not where Manitobans are at, and it's only where this member and his party are at. On a practical level and on a day-to-day basis, this member continues to support a party that has taken away revenue and sources of income from local journalists and local newspapers. Bill 8, the member says he was at the caucus table. He stood in lockstep with this government to take away the notices that were required by government. As our party, as the official opposition, stood up and fought back against that taking away of notices for local newspapers. He stood by while this government took away subsidies for recycling for local newspapers, which hit their bottom line significantly. And yet he doesn't speak up about that. And yet just a few weeks ago, I looked back in the Hansard, I looked for references just a few weeks ago as Bill 53 went through the stages in this legislature. I looked for the member opposite to bring forward words against his government about this taking away of notices for municipalities, a further erosion of the responsibility and role for local newspapers. I saw nothing. I saw no reference from the member opposite. And yet his own minister stood up in the House, repeatedly misled the House as we asked direct questions, said, no, that's not what the intent of this bill is. And yet we see that local newspapers are getting hit hard. Time and time and time again, it is our party that is standing up for local newspapers, speaking up for local voices, and speaking up for local choices. This government continues to attack journalists. You know, it might be Rosemary Barton one week. It might be Danleth the next week. Manitobans understand that they want the true information from journalists. They want a strong, independent media in this province. And that does include those local voices. So we'll stand up on the practical level every single day to support those local newspapers, to ensure that they have the revenue, to ensure that they are sustainable going into the future. But we'll also stand up for their voices in terms of the journalism that they do, to speak out against this government as they so choose or as they see fit. We support the work that they do on the local level to bring to attention when members opposite are silent when it comes to issues in their constituency. We will fight for their right to do that. And we will fight for all newspapers and all journalists, whether it's the Free Press, the Winnipeg Sun, whether it's any other print media or any other journalism. There's an important role to be played. And despite what this member wants, he wants a post-truth Manitoba. He wants to be able to say one thing. He supports his leader when his leader goes out and misleads and doesn't tell the truth. Well, that's fine. We will not stand by. We'll call them out every single chance that we get. We'll call them out, and we will not fall into this post-truth world that the member opposite wants to bring. Words matter, but actions matter too. So if the member really supports local newspapers, I invite him to actually stand with us as we fight for them, to withdraw this resolution and stand by local journalism every single day of the week. Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
The Honorable Minister of Advanced Education, Skills and Immigration.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and it gives me great pleasure this morning to put a few words on the record to this great resolution put forward by my colleague, the member from Borderland. Before I get into some of the misinformation slash disinformation that the member from Concordia once again puts on the record from his narrow view from a small corner within the city of Winnipeg, Mr. Deputy Speaker, as evidence proved that when it took the time to actually mention a few newspapers, didn't mention any. So as far as, besides some of the big ones within the city of Winnipeg, but that, as my colleague from Borderland had mentioned earlier, speaking to the resolution, is the fact that the NDP, they stand up for local newspapers. If it's so local as to just within the city of Winnipeg, that's who they stand up for. But it is going to give me some great pleasure to put a few factual words on the record in regards to the federal government's program. But before I get going, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I do want to ask the member for the Liberal, the leader of the Manitoba Liberal Party, that when he gets an opportunity to stand up and speak to possibly this or the next opportunity in the House, is to actually stand up and apologize to the House for putting disinformation on the record. Mr. Deputy Speaker, unfortunately, the leader of the Manitoba Liberal Party, and I see he's very inquisitive, listening attentively to what I'm going to say next. But the fact is that the member for Riding Mountain has many years of experience in the community newspaper industry. He was involved for approximately 40 years, but in fact, the leader of the Manitoba Liberal Party should do his homework, as many of his former students should have done. Do some fact checking before you go and put disinformation on the record. And this is going to the leader of the Manitoba Liberal Party, that the member for Riding Mountain actually does not own any shares in any community newspapers here in Manitoba, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So I will wait to listen to the leader of the Manitoba Liberal Party apologize later on for putting that disinformation. And the reason why I'm saying not misinformation is because I do believe he did it deliberately. But if he wants to correct the record and say that he was misinformed by his speechwriters, then that's fine too. So we'll wait for that later on.
I would just like to remind the minister that using the words misleading or deliberately misleading is not proper parliamentary language. So I would ask the member to retract that and continue with his speech. The Honorable Minister of Advanced Education, Skills and Immigration.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and thanks for the advisement. I didn't believe that I did say misleading, but I did definitely say misinformation and disinformation, but I'll take your words as gospel, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and retract my misleading comment. But I do know for a fact that the leader of the Manitoba Liberal Party was definitely putting disinformation on the record, Mr. Deputy Speaker. So I will continue going on with the resolution. I think the member from Concordia missed the boat a little bit, as he often does, and I'm not sure. I was sort of hoping that, I know that their party doesn't like to talk about the small watercraft such as canoes, but so I'm going to refrain from talking about any type of steering small watercraft in any kind of a more positive direction. But the fact is, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that the federal program to support journalism, there's 3 separate tax measures put out by the federal Liberal Party. And that's basically that the Canadian Journalism Labor Tax Credit, which is a 25% refundable tax credit on salaries or wages payable in respect of an eligible newsroom employee for periods beginning on or after January 1st, 2019. There's another one, the Digital News Subscription Tax Credit, a 15% non-refundable personal income tax credit for digital news subscription costs paid by an individual to a qualified Canadian journalism organization, which applies to qualifying amounts paid after 2019 and before 2025, and a new type of qualified donation recipient called a registered journalism organization for not-for-profit journalism organizations, which is in effect as of January 1st, 2020. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the problem is who's eligible for this. And the reason for the resolution this morning, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is so that we stand united. As the member from Concordia mentioned, he likes to say that his party stands up and is in favor of community newspapers, the small and the large ones. We know that in order to be eligible for these said federal liberal tax credits or incentives, is basically that the budget stated that the news outlets must be qualified, in quotation, qualified Canadian journalism organizations. So QCJO for short, in order to be eligible for the funding. However, the designation of a QCJO is still being determined by the government. So basically what we're trying to do, and what the resolution's trying to do, is show that Manitoba is standing in solidarity, basically asking the federal government to make sure that they're taking a look at who qualifies for those tax subsidies, the program. So that's what the resolution's doing, is basically that we here in Manitoba are standing up for newspapers. We know that, I have the pleasure of out in the Lac du Bonnet constituency, having 3 small community newspapers right now. We've got the Clipper, which is divided up into the original Clipper, and then the Lac du Bonnet Clipper, and then we've got the Dawson Trail Dispatch, and then we've got the Carillon. And recently, unfortunately, the Winnipeg River Echo is going through some changes, so they're not printing right now. But this just speaks to the fact that some organizations, the federal Liberal government needs to consider some of these other newspapers when they are talking about putting forward these types of tax credits. I know that the member from Concordia, of course, mentioned the Winnipeg Free Press and some of their editors and that, and he also did mention the Winnipeg Sun, to be fair. But the 4 that are eligible right now is the Winnipeg Free Press, the Winnipeg Sun, the Brandon Sun, and the Carillon, which is fine. But the federal government needs to take a look at community newspapers as well. I know that many businesses, many small community newspapers are free subscription, and they get their revenue from paid advertising and small business support within their newspapers. I know that right now the leader of the Manitoba Liberal Party is racking his brain out on how he's going to be apologizing right away. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think the biggest problem with this program and Mr. Deputy Speaker, is the fact that for newspapers, it only includes those news organizations that have those online subscriptions, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And again, the only papers right now that are eligible are the 4 that I've already mentioned: the Winnipeg Free Press, the Sun, the Carillon, and the Brandon Sun. And then good on them, absolutely. But the fact is that community newspapers are facing a real risk of shutting down. And the federal government has created an incentive program that only helps drive subscriptions to the large conglomerate news chains. And so we've already heard the member from Concordia mention a few of his favorite journalists, and I'm not going to put any disparaging comments on the record in regards to anybody that is getting a paycheck writing some stories. But that being said, this resolution basically focuses on the fact that we are calling, through the member from Borderland, calling on the federal government to revise and improve the federal government's journalism subsidies. That's all. This is not a nonpartisan thing. This is a standing up for Manitoba thing. And definitely for our small rural community newspapers. And there are some also within the city of Winnipeg. So I would like the member from Concordia also just to stop putting partisan politics up front, and let's pass this resolution unanimously this morning, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Thanks for the time.
The member for Kiiwetinoong.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I currently, as I am sitting remotely, I'm sitting on Treaty 5 territory, and I do want to acknowledge that the Legislature, where we are sitting remotely and via Zoom, is on Treaty 1 territory, home of the Ojibwe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota Dene, Inuit peoples, and homeland of the Métis Nation. Now that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is a PMR that should be a priority of this government, not the PMR that currently exists before us. And understand the member from Borderland who also contributed to talking out the land acknowledgement PMR, I might add, brings forth a private member's resolution at this time to really show the lack of priority by this government and its representation of the entire province. The member from Lac-du-Bon had pointed out that my esteemed colleague from Concordia represents a small corner of Winnipeg, when in fact, now here I am speaking representing the big corner of the province. And I'm sure it'll just take a Google search to be able to see that, in fact, the biggest corner of the province. So when you Google the notes that you seem to be putting out on behalf of supporting your lackluster resolutions, then look at that as a priority. Mr. Deputy Speaker, there's a number of things that lead me to wonder exactly why during this time of a global pandemic, these various private members' bills, private members' resolutions are being brought forward as a priority when there's other things that are currently going on of more importance and not specific to the north, not specific to urban areas or rural areas, but specific overall. The member from Borderland had talked about how vaccine uptake is extremely low in his constituency, but yet he chooses to take this PMR as a priority instead of prioritizing how to increase that vaccine uptake. I think that's something that his time would be much better spent on doing so that we can all overcome this pandemic together. But in speaking directly to the resolution at hand, it just goes to show the disconnect that this government and the Premier has, and the member from Borderland has, with what's going on today. While we call on greater supports for the media, this government's own words contradict that. And the supports that are being called on, and there's a number of resolutions, a number of private members' bills, resolutions, media, tweets, social media posts, releases that are given out by this government that consistently calls on the federal government for this, calls on them for that, for increased supports. But yet at the same time, those same supports are not existing from this current government. So for this government to go hat in hand and ask the federal government for additional funds, or maybe one of their bags of money that they claim that they have, when meanwhile you're not actively engaging in spending your own financial resources at this level to help either local businesses or help during the pandemic. It cites I've heard the words, and it reminds me back to my childhood of Scrooge McDuck, who's kind of trying to hold all the money, but look like they're coming off like the rich people in the province to be able to overcome, but not spending the money when it should be spent. So that the priority of this government is just totally lost on everybody. It's lost on the member from Borderland, obviously, and I understand that there gets a point where he has to look like he's contributing to the workings of this government, but we all know that that's a top-down approach, that if you're not in the inner circle, you really don't have anything to contribute and anything to add, and you just have to continue on with the marching orders that are being put forth by you. So when we talk about the local investment, and in particular with this resolution, the local investment in local media and local papers, that message being brought forth and that sense of urgency being brought forth by a member from Borderland is not being supported by his own party, is not being supported by his own Premier. Perhaps maybe if the Premier ever got to be able to do that and actually go and contribute and make a contribution to the paper, it would come with a clause. It would come with a a disclaimer saying that if we support the local newspapers, you have to for sure have my face on the front page 9 out of 10 editions. You have to promote me 9 out of 10 times. You have to use that to prop that up. And really that gets into being propaganda. That doesn't get into being any kind of media. So if we called on these federal supports and we support this resolution to call it federal subsidies, is that something that would then have to be in place by the Premier? Would the Premier insist on, well, this is all great, but you have to support us. You have to be able to allow our party to be able to do what we want to do and not be unbiased. You have to be biased in my favor. Because we all know how the Premier reacts to quote unquote fake news. You know, when the facts of your dealings in government, the facts of your failures, the facts of your ineptitudes are being brought forth, that's not fake news. That's news being brought forth in a concise way for all the people of Manitoba. No matter where you reside, whether you reside in the smallest corner of Winnipeg or you reside in the biggest corner of the province, those facts are on the record, and those facts have the right to be heard and right to be seen by all, without partisan politics and being able to be manipulated in any sort of form. And that just doesn't exist from this government, Mr. Deputy Speaker. There's always a catch. There's always a catch to a support. There's always a catch to a financial contribution by this government. And in particular, I mean, it gets me back to the tax rebate. You know, they want to have a check signed by the Premier or signed by the Minister. Again, there's a catch to an advantage in a rebate program. It goes back to the $200 subsidy that was given back to elders in our province. It came with a personal letter signed by, well, we all know the Premier's first name, signed personally by that. But yet would not sign layoff notices to hydro workers, would not sign layoff notices to civil servants. So when we get back to the lack of supports from this government consistently talks about the failures of the federal government in not being able to step up, not being able to do various things for the communities. And of course, in this time, we're dealing with primarily the pandemic. The Premier likes to point out the failures of the pandemic, the failures of the federal government in the supports, but never once very own government in not being able to support those same things. Even just over the last few days, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there's been a number of calls for the Premier to now be a leader. He touts himself as being a greeter and the best leader in the province, the best Premier in the province. He's in the top 10, you know, he is 10th, but it is the top 10 nonetheless, in terms of favorable premiers in the province. But I'm sure that's a spin, that's the kind of spin that he would want to put on that. But failing to lead, you know, why wait for the federal government to make contributions? Why wait for the federal government to step up? And why then attempt to fill in any kind of potential gaps that may exist after the federal government? Why not be the leader? Why not be at the forefront? Why not be the initiator of various programs? Why not be the initiator of supports for these newspapers? And in thinking in the last couple of days, Mr. Deputy Speaker, why isn't the Premier being the leader in calling for the call for the search for residential school mass grave sites? Why not be the leader? That was asked in estimates yesterday, and that wasn't made a priority. Instead, this PMR today is being listed as a priority. Why isn't it priority to the Premier then to be the leader and initiate and get out there and say, this is what we're going to do. This is what we want to do for the people of Manitoba. But instead, the private member's resolution brought today by the member for Borderland is calling on the federal government to revise and improve the federal government's journalism subsidies is the priority. And that's just a simple failure. In this last day of legislature, this last day of sitting, that's the priority. With all of the emerging issues and all of the people in Manitoba that are suffering financially, suffering ill health, not knowing whether they're going to survive payday to payday, paycheck to paycheck. The priority is still to bring forth this PMR. And it's just embarrassing. It's just embarrassing to be able to think that this is what the government feels is a priority. And instead, let's call in the feds, let's call in the feds to do this, call in the feds to do that. And at the same time, not stepping up to own your own responsibility. And it's just shameful, Mr. Deputy Speaker.
The member's time has expired. The member for St. Boniface.
Thank you, Mr. Assistant Deputy Speaker. Yeah, I mean, I'll address the comments by the MLA for Lac du Bonnet. The fact is that the MLA for Riding Mountain, when Bill 8 came forward, recused himself because he said he had a conflict of interest because his family is involved in running a series of newspapers who would benefit directly from this. The Minnedosa Tribune, on its online site, says supported by the Government of Canada, because these newspapers, as many rural newspapers have been receiving the Canadian wage subsidy, which is completely legitimate. Look, I actually believe in supporting rural newspapers and supporting reporting and democracy, but you know what? There's a way that we can get the message about vaccines into those newspapers, and it would be for the provincial government to buy ads. They're newspapers. They work through buying ads. They don't have to work through subsidy. That and one of the things about newspapers versus advertising is you get to control the message in an ad. If the entire expectation of this government seems to be that if you're paying a newspaper, you get to tell them what to print. That's only in the ad section. It's not in the reporting section, and it's not in the editorial section. This government went out of its way to undermine newspapers. And look, I agree. Could the federal government be doing more? Yes. But I don't understand why this government is always asking the federal government to do more when they're not doing anything. We keep asking people to do, why don't you do a better job of something when the people asking aren't doing anything? And it's clear that there's a much deeper issue with here with trying to discredit the Winnipeg Free Press. The PCEs have been very clear about that. The fact is that the way these programs have been designed is that it's designed to support reporting. And some of that reporting is going to be about things that we don't want to hear. That's life. That's politics. But to make a political issue of this and to spend our hour debating this when the entire government side is in a position to put forward money and talk to the Premier or the Finance Minister and say, you know what, we should spend some money encouraging people to get vaccinations in rural newspapers. That would be a pretty simple fix. And it would actually be this government's job, because this government is overwhelmingly expected to just do an announcement a day and then let reporters and journalists do all the heavy lifting about communications. And that's not acceptable or appropriate. I think over a year ago, we called for more investments. We called for independent, non-political advertising. And this is also a government, for all that the federal government is supposed to have bags of money, this is a government that has never had any problem finding money for $300 million for the PST, $250 million for property tax cuts for pipelines, or for $200 million for Investors Group Stadium. It's a question of priorities. And if this were really a priority of this government, they would be putting money into it themselves. And it's not. That's all I have to say.
The member for Portage La Prairie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for Borderlands for putting this forward. As he noted in some of his comments, I also represent an area where local journalism and local newspapers have always been a very important part of our community. In fact, we're one of the few small communities outside of Winnipeg that did have a daily paper for many, many years. And it was a victim of the massive changes in terms of advertising that we have seen that is somewhat related to the development of advertising on social media. It's also probably a little related to the fact that businesses are now much larger and want to advertise across the whole province, and of course pursue that in the large province-wide. newspapers rather than little local ones, which I think is a mistake on their part because they certainly lose loyalty in the community. And we went through the whole process here in my constituency of going from a daily to a 3 times a week process, to finally to a weekly, and then for a very short period of time having no newspaper at all other than an online version. And of course, as the member for Concordia noted, many of these small papers are going to a very strong online presence, and that's something that I know our government has been working towards.
Order. When this matter is again before the House, the member for Portage La Prairie will have 8 minutes remaining. The hour being 12 o'clock, this House is recessed and stands recessed until 1:30 p.m.